Afternoon, everybody. I think we couldn't have hoped for a better start of the conference, and I learned a great deal from this morning's papers and our conversations, so thanks from my side for that as well. My name is Karin Krause, and I am an assistant professor of Byzantine Theology and Visual Culture here at the Divinity School, and it's my pleasure to chair session 2 of this conference on the idea of the global. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Becker. Professor Becker's research interests include Christian martyr texts in the Sasanian Iran, Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity, the social and intellectual history of the Syriac Christian Aramaic tradition, and the missionary encounter in the 19th century. His book, Fear of God and the Beginning of Wisdom, The School of Nisibis and the Development of Christian Scholastic Culture in Late Antique Mesopotamia, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2006. The book grounds the reception of Greek philosophical and patristic literature in the social life of Christian schools in the Sasanian Empire. In 2015 was published his book Revival and Awakening, American Evangelical Missionaries in Iran and the Origins of Assyrian Nationalism by the University of Chicago Press. In it, Becker links the development of secular nationalism among Christians in the 19th century Middle East to American Protestant ideas of religious reform. Adam Becker is currently editing some of the works attributed to Isaac of Antioch, a Syriac poet of the 5th to 6th century. Professor Becker's editorial work forms part of a larger project on ethical exhortation and the perceived moral failure of Christianization in late antique Syria. I look forward to his paper that has a nice title, The Pre-Global, Global, Going Global. Please join me in welcoming Adam Becker.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the hospitality that I've received. I have to apologize for the title. It was my first thought in response to the question we were asked in the invitation to this event. It was a question about the rubric of global Christianity. So how useful is it? And I thought, well, obviously the Church of the East, the church that I've done a lot of work on, the Church of the East was global in a way. It had spread across Asia by the late first millennium CE, and so it's long been global in the simple sense of the term. But on the other hand, there is something different about the Church of the East in the modern period, and so it was already global, but then it also went global. So that was my pre-global, global, going global. So what is the exact meaning of global and global Christianity? I know there are more nuanced ideas about this, because people have actually thought about this a lot more. And so in a way, it's daunting to speak after Professor Robert, because she just gave this whole history of the development of world Christianity, global Christianity, these categories. And I'm approaching this as someone who never really thought about it before, and then just said, okay, well, what does global Christianity do for me as a historian, whatever I work on? So these were my thoughts about that, and I was aware that there was another conversation, but I wasn't going to get too involved in that. So I hope that my own ignorance about the history of this usage is refreshing. For me, at least, the expression improves upon world Christianity, which seems to just kind of implied like the global South and perhaps also Asia, but it somehow implies to me non-European. Rather, global Christianity suggests to me a self-consciousness about Christianity's global movement, including via modern Western missions, and the complex dynamic of Christianity in the contemporary world. However, again, was the Church of the East not engaged in global movement long before all this? Global could mean universalizing or open to translation in various senses of the word translation. But in that case, Christianity was already global during the Roman Empire. Similarly, if global means deterritorialized or disembedded, Christianity has always been deterritorialized, even within its various localizations, and even disembedded in as much as the emergence of Christianity was an important step in the process of the development of the category of religion itself. Or is global an analytical term that emphasizes a certain characteristic of Christianity that has always been there, but which has been sped up within the modern period? And this would fit with the idea that modernity should not be characterized by its content, but by its pace. Yet, is there something more global about contemporary Christianity? Something like faster, more globaler, whatever, if that's not even a word. What would this be? So I'm going to leave these questions about the global and then return to them in the end. In my paper, I'd like to address the modern history of the Church of the East, and then bring us back later to the question of the global. Now, I work on the Syriac Christian tradition. I work on this tradition in late antiquity and the early Islamic period, so like 4th into the 8th centuries, but also in the 19th and early 20th century. My 2015 book, Revival and Awakening, American Missionaries in Iran and the Origins of Assyrian Nationalism, was a study, as the name suggests, of how the missionary encounter between members of the Church of the East and American evangelical Christians resulted in the unintended consequence of Assyrian nationalism. Whereas my mission book focused on the effects of mission, especially evangelical missions, on a Middle Eastern church, and what I use the expression missionary modernity in the book. What I want to focus on today is how in the mission encounter, certain characteristics the East Syrian tradition had in common with American missionary Christianity, because of their distantly shared Christian heritage, were articulated in a new way in this encounter. And this may point to one way of thinking about the global. So I should give you some background. The Assyrians are an ethno-religious community who in the early 20th century lived primarily in the region of what is now southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and northwestern Iran. They're part of a broader Syriac Christian tradition, which includes other churches such as the Syrian Orthodox and the Maronites. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, attested first in the 2nd century CE in Edessa, modern Urfa in Turkey. It came to function as Latin did for the Catholic Church as a language of liturgy and intellectual engagement, even while members of the Syriac churches increasingly became speakers of Arabic, Neo-Aramaic, and various other languages. Living today in Iran and Iraq, as well as scattered in a worldwide diaspora, there's a large community, in fact, in Chicago, an old community going back to the late 19th century of Assyrians. The Assyrians are part of a larger Syriac or Christian Aramaic community that numbers perhaps as many as 3 million, and this does not include the large Syriac Christian communities in South India. Historically, the Assyrians belonged to the Church of the East, a separate ecclesiastical entity deriving from the Christological disputes of the 5th century. In Western sources, even up to the present, East Syrians, as members of the Church of the East, are commonly referred to as Nestorians, after Nestorius, the 5th century supposed founder of their heresy. By the time of the Arab conquest in the mid-7th century, the Church's hierarchy extended through central Iraq down into southern Iran and the Persian Gulf, and its successful proselytism was already aimed eastward into Central Asia, where Christianity would most famously prove attractive to the Mongols centuries later. So, for example, Kublai Khan's mother was a Nestorian Christian. With the exception of communities in South India, by the 19th century, the Church of the East had shrunk, and the majority of those members in northern Iraq, for example, around Mosul, had joined the Uniate Catholic Church, commonly known today as the Chaldeans. Old church membership persisted in the plains west of Lake Urumia, today in northwestern Iran, and in the mountains of Hakkari in modern Turkey. When the American mission was first established in Urumia in the 1830s, the Nestorians, or the Syrians as they usually called themselves, identified as members of the Church of the East, as well as with their local tribes and villages. Today, in contrast, the East Syrians call themselves Assyrians. Within the context of foreign missions, especially the American mission, By the turn of the 20th century, a national consciousness had developed whereby many Assyrians understood themselves to be descendants of an ancient Near Eastern nation, even a separate race. In my book, Revival and Awakening, I demonstrate how the presence of American evangelical missionaries in the borderlands between Qajar, Iran and the Ottoman Empire contributed to the development of a secularized, but not desacralized, national identity among the indigenous Christian population of the region. The Americans aimed to reform and revive the ancient Church of the East by establishing schools, publishing and distributing literature in the vernacular, and preaching a penitential return to biblical Christianity. However, their intervention in the region helped rather to lay the groundwork for a new identity and communal understanding articulated by the East Syrians, many of whom then started to call themselves Assyrians. And this begins, the focus on the name Assyrian begins in the 1890s, but it really takes off in the context of World War I and the Assyrian genocide, and then in diaspora from the 1920s onwards. So it actually goes global. The church membership, in a sense, goes global, and this Assyrian identity is taken up further. One of the arguments in my work is that it was only after a national consciousness and national ways of relating to one another and others had come into being that the East Syrians then took up the name Assyrian. By the turn of the 20th century, some East Syrian nationalists responded auto-ethnographically to the Orientalist and biblical archaeological knowledge, which was disseminated by the missions in vernacular publications, by locating their origins historically in the ancient Near East. They linked the national consciousness that had been developing through the 19th century to the name and history of the Assyrians, and this identification persists in the community today. Briefly, I'm going to give you just a sense of Assyrian nationalism by describing some of its most obvious manifestations. In this way, you can better understand really how radically new it is. And this is where I regret I didn't use images, because there's a fascinating visual archive of Assyrianizing from the 1920s onwards, both the use of the images from ancient Nineveh and things that are kind of marked as Assyrian, but also in church architecture. It just pictures, I end up sitting and looking at them, and I get too distracted. Today, some Assyrians celebrate the 1st of Nisan as the Assyrian New Year. And this has been re-rendered by some as the revived ancient Assyrian Akitu festival, at which some celebrants even dress in faux ancient Assyrian garb, including fake long beards. At times, Assyrian nationalists even engage in esoteric readings of Scripture, such as a rather heterodox interpretation of God's self-revelation at Exodus 3:14, I am who I am, in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. This line is taken to be a hidden revelation of the ancient Assyrian divinity, Ashur. What people do is, because in Semitic languages you can write without the vowels, and the relative pronoun who or which in Hebrew, Asher, if you change the vowels, you can make it look like Ashur, like the ancient Near Eastern god. And so Exodus 3:14 is taken as a kind of a secret revelation that the god of the Assyrians is actually in the biblical text. This is definitely not Orthodox Christianity. This line is taken to be a hidden revelation. Some Assyrian nationalist literature even argues that the Bible is a biased document, a piece of anti-Assyrian propaganda, hence the description of the Assyrians as warlike. A notable example of the synthesis between the church and Assyrian identity is the renaming of the church itself. It's today called the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, this is theologically problematic too, to name a church ethnically like this. It's like saying like Roman Catholic is theologically problematic, right? Because that makes something not so Catholic. It's like in the Mel Brooks film To Be or Not to Be, when Anne Bancroft's character says about her husband that he's world famous in Poland. There's a kind of universalizing and limiting at the same time. So what happens when two Christianities meet? One issue that came up while working on this project was finding a way to talk about the encounter between two different Christianities. I never resolved this question for myself. Whereas in my mission book, I focused on the direct effects of evangelicalism on the East Syrian community, One related phenomenon is how in this encounter with American missionaries, the East Syrians discovered certain parts of their own tradition to be more useful for communicating with the Americans. Parts of their own tradition that corresponded with the missionaries' own Christian idiom. In turn, the Americans drew out these points of contact, and in this back and forth translation, certain long-established tendencies within the East Syrian tradition were activated, but with a new valence. And it would be interesting to take this and if any, I don't know if any work has been done really thinking about Christian-Christian mission contact. So, for example, Mormonism and other forms of Christianity and how Mormonism spreads in certain ways among other Christians. Or with this question from this morning of like the Pentecostalization of the church, that it's really two different Christianities meeting and how that works. Although in their scale and practice, missions are modern institutions, the Christianity of the missionaries clearly fit into the wide-ranging Christian tradition, which demonstrates a number of characteristics common to most instantiations of Christianity. Aside from the obvious ones, such as a focus on Scripture or Jesus, right? Most Christians like Jesus. Included among these characteristics are the idea of conversion, the problem of enculturation, that is the relationship between Christianity and culture, the notion of the imitation of Christ, which is best attested in martyrdom, and the regular epistemological, experiential, and ontological distinction between immanence and transcendence. The notion of reform, which is intensified in modern missions, is another characteristic of this discursive tradition. Multiple strains of Christianity commonly posit the possibility of transforming the human being, of recreating from its fallen state the human created in the beginning in the image of God. Accordingly, Christianization has always entailed a notion of reform, as well as the delimitation of Christianity itself through creed and practices. Because instrumental to proselytism is the objectification of Christianity, right? Because you have to define what it is that you're trying to convey to people. All encounters entail a dialectical interaction in which certain practices, ideas, and language are drawn out due to the useful proximities discovered in such interaction. All forms of contact and communication result in a kind of self-discovery. Like, this works, this doesn't work, try a little more of this. What I'm interested in here is this kind of reflexive negotiation and discovery of commonalities, but specifically when two Christianities meet. So I'm going to provide 4 examples of this from this encounter between the Americans and the Assyrians. First, the Hebrew Bible has built into it what we may call a language of nations. Scholars of nationalism, especially Anthony Smith, have emphasized that in the development of nationalism in the modern period, the language of peoplehood we find in the Bible was especially productive. Israel was a great nation. It had enemies among the various nations. The language of peoplehood we find in the Hebrew Bible has long served Christians as a source for thinking about community, whether Christianity was a nation from among the many nations, in contrast to the one nation, the Jews, or in the Pauline emphasis on spreading the gospel to the nations, that is, the Gentiles. Because the East Syrian tradition had already employed this language of biblical nationhood, they seemed to recognize such language when American missionaries brought with them a similar version of it, albeit one inflected through American Protestantism and republicanism. Furthermore, this was an inflection that was more racialized than anything the East Syrians had known before. A second related example. The East Syrians called themselves Eastern and placed themselves within a Christian geography. They were the Church of the East. In this case, the East originally meant east of the Roman Empire, that is, Sasanian or pre-Islamic Iran. It also meant east of Jerusalem and the imagined homeland of monasticism, Egypt. The title East also distinguished them from their historical theological adversaries, the West Syrians, or the Syrian Orthodox, who originally inhabited Roman Syria. This geographical Easternness took on a symbolic significance over time and contributed to the development of a sacred geography. For example, the Gospel of Matthew's wise men from the East, the Magi, were imagined by some East Syrians as being from their own land. The story of Jonah and the Ninevites was particularly popular among Syriac Christians. Jonah's tomb, so it was thought, was right there across the Tigris, from Mosul. This self-consciousness about the East would eventually be conducive to the auto-orientalizing that the East Syrians engaged in once they met foreign missionaries who brought with them American and European ideas of the Orient. And it's noteworthy that some of the missionaries and later some of the missionized East Syrians were significant Orientalist scholars in their own day. From the late 19th century on, Syriac Christians traveled in England and the US, where they would speak their native Neo-Aramaic before crowds of enthusiastic Protestants. Introduced as museum piece holdovers from the age of the patriarchs, they performed the so-called language of Jesus and brought to life a Christian fantasy of the Orient. Thus, it is not surprising that it was in the context of Western missions that the name Assyrian took hold. All Christians knew Assyria, and the name Assyrian was a retrieval with pedigree. A third example of how the East Syrian tradition was drawn upon within the missionary encounter due to a shared heritage. And this is where it starts to get kind of weird but interesting. From 1849 on, the American mission printed the monthly periodical Rays of Light, Zahrire de Bahra. This newspaper had several sections, including ones on science, education, and news. The front section, which was devoted to piety, was given the title Fear of God, Dekhlat Allah. This focus on piety as distinct from news or science reflects what will later be the secularity that emerges at the mission. That is, religion is different from news and science. It's noteworthy that this newspaper was in Neo-Aramaic and Dekhlat Allah is a classical Syriac expression. Considering the general absence of interest in the indigenous tradition among the early American missionaries, it is striking that they decided to appropriate and employ this classical Syriac expression so prominently. This expression has a long history in classical Syriac, and fear at times functions in Syriac not wholly unlike our own category of religion. Obviously, the expression fear of God is partly based upon biblical usage, such as Proverbs 9:10, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But in Syriac literature, fear, dekhlitha, has a vibrant life of its own. There are various fears. Most fears are false: Judaism, paganism, heresy. But one, Christianity, is the true fear, the fear of God. This expression is used most often in classical Syriac literature in the so-called Persian martyr acts. The Persian martyr acts are a large corpus of Syriac martyrological texts composed from the 4th century into the Islamic period. They detail the martyrdom of a diversity of Christians at the hands of Sasanian kings, bureaucrats, and priests. Martyrdom is a productive genre for the discourse of religion because martyrdom is about communal and creedal boundaries and the articulation of the definitive difference that makes a Christian a Christian. Martyrdom is also about the false, ultimate object of fear, death. Thus, it is not a coincidence that this word, dekhlitha, fear, is used in this literature most often as a technical term for something approximating religion or piety. What is discussed in the Fear of God section of the American Mission newspaper? So this classical terms taken up by the Americans. Interestingly, this opening section of the paper, which was dedicated to general calls for devotion and leading a more pious life, disproportionately focused on death. It borrowed the contemporary American and British homiletic focus on death, especially death before one's time, to promote a distinctly evangelical devotion. Often, and this is like about a quarter of the time, this section of the paper consisted of an obituary for someone from the local community who had died young. That these long, pathetic life narratives with extensive deathbed scenes were published several years after the death of their subjects demonstrates their ultimately homiletical as opposed to informational value. So they were putting obituaries at the front of the paper, but for people who had died like 3 or 4 years earlier. Fear of God was an expression that in the classical Syriac tradition had meant correct piety, especially as demonstrated by the martyr in the moment of her or his impending death. Now it meant a correct every man's piety through an evangelical acceptance of salvation by faith alone, salvation that was performed through its prefigurement on the deathbed. In both cases, the identification of the correct object of fear, that is, God instead of death, was employed to demonstrate what piety is. Now, a fourth and final example of this meeting, commonality between the two churches. The idea of reform. In my mission book, I linked the idea of reform to missionary modernity. However, reform is also part of Christianity's long story. In his 1959 study, The Idea of Reform, Gerhard Ladner provides his well-known definition. He suggests reform is, quote, the idea of free, intentional, and ever-perfectible, multiple, prolonged, and ever-repeated efforts by man to reassert and augment values pre-existent in the spiritual material compound of the world. For Ladner, reform lies at the heart of Christianity, and it entails a this-worldly restoration of something that is also not of this world. Ladner's emphasis is on reform as an idea mobilizing Christians across history, and he seems to be, he's like engaged in a kind of old-fashioned Marx Weber debate. I think it would be better to describe reform as a characteristic of the Christian discursive tradition, that is, part of an embodied and given argument that develops through time. Ladner is useful because his work suggests how reform is not simply what occurred in the Reformation, or before this in the High Middle Ages. Rather, some form of it seems always to be part of the tradition. Certainly in Western churches in the post-Reformation period, reform became a focus, motivating many and playing itself out in the missionary field. In fact, the competing Western missions of the 19th century may be understood as divergent versions of reform. However, ideas about reform were already prevalent among the East Syrians. As we've seen already with the ideas about nation and Christian geography and the linkage between death and piety, missionaries and indigenous Christians at times spoke a similar Christian idiom. Missionaries' calls for renewal would have been familiar to East Syrians, whose own tradition held that human beings received a renewal, chudata is the Syriac to the classical term, by the coming of Christ. The Church of the East had long emphasized the idea of restoring that image of God which was diminished by Adam's transgression. Penitence, teyavutha, literally return, was a part of the East Syrian devotion. The abundant East Syrian literature of monastic spirituality of the early Islamic period demonstrates that a particular tradition of care for the self had developed within the church. In one episode, early at the American mission, a local bishop, in response to lectures about temperance from American teetotalers, so this bishop was annoyed because Americans were like going, you shouldn't drink. He indignantly brought out a manuscript of an East Syrian monastic writer who condemned the misuse of alcohol. The East Syrians had their own tradition of moral reform. However, eventually, American ideas of renewal resonated with the local tradition in a new and secular way. By the early 20th century, East Syrians were regularly calling for the moral reform, but of their nation. So, bringing these genealogical lines together, and this is where I tried to use a linguistic model and decided it didn't work. The distant genealogical links between American and also European Christianity and that of the Church of the East resulted in a new articulation of ancient tendencies within East Syrian Christianity. Ideas of nationality and Easternness, fear as a category of piety, ideas of renewal and reform, all these were part of the indigenous East Syrian tradition. These tendencies were articulated in a new way in response to the missionary encounter and contributed to the development of Assyrian nationalism, which went truly global in the aftermath of the Assyrian genocide. Now, I originally thought, and this was in my abstract actually, I would bring in an analogy from linguistics to think about the meeting of American and East Syrian Christians. It is the case that genetically related languages allow for intralinguistic transfer more easily. For example, like Spanish and Italian speakers or Akkadian and Aramaic speakers are more likely to influence one another linguistically because of the proximity of their respective languages. So using a linguistic model for thinking about culture, this wouldn't be new, and it also has its problems. This is common. In fact, we use a linguistic model in talking about translation all the time in the missionary encounter. Borrowing between cognate languages, or among dialects of the same language, that is internal borrowing, is more difficult to identify than contact between distinct languages because the borrowing may be seamlessly intertwined with existing paradigms. How do we identify what comes from where when the two are so similar? So this is just the question of endogenous versus exogenous change. If we treat the Christianity of American evangelicals and that of the East Syrians as cognate languages or distantly related dialects of the same language, would this help us think about their encounter? These two distantly related languages have a shared heritage that is multi-layered. They both have derivations from the ancient Near East through the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism, from the New Testament and early Christian tradition, and from late antique Hellenism and patristics. One, however, then followed its course through the Latin West, medieval Europe, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and further developed in North America. The other developed its own tradition while interacting with other Eastern Christians, prospered under the Abbasids, persisted with and within Arabicization and the Islamization of the Middle East, and had already been engaging with Catholicism since the 16th century. A problem one hits upon when trying to use a linguistic analogy for how these two forms of Christianity interacted is that the result of the mission encounter was a new entity, a kind of third language, Assyrian nationalism. To be more explicit in my analogy, and this is why I think it doesn't really work, is what if German and English speakers lived next to one another and some aspects of English that it shared with German were drawn out in such a way that it was no longer English at all? Perhaps not even a language at all, but some kind of new mode of communication, a language turned inside out. Oh, okay, yeah. The linguistic analogy is awkward. In it, what is the nationalism that emerges from two Christianities? A third language or something just totally different? And maybe this reconfiguration into a new structure has something to do with what is distinctive about the global. And so now I'm going to return to the global for a moment. Briefly, to return to the question of the global, this no doubt reflects my own limited engagement with this problem, because I hide behind saying I'm an ancient historian. But at first glance, I did not see how global Christianity is a particularly beneficial heuristic tool, except to designate the conversation in which we are all engaged here today in similar conversations. What I mean is that it seems to be more useful as a disciplinary reification than as a term of analysis. Is there something distinctly global about global Christianity? Or is it not rather a form of analysis that interdisciplinarily takes into account the movements and flows of modernity? The global has always been part of Christianity since the Great Commission. Christians are asked to go forth and seek disciples and to bear witness even to the ends of the earth. That sounds global. Moreover, as I already stated, the long history of the Church of the East challenges the notion that global, in this simple sense, is a useful term for identifying something distinctive about Christianity in our own time. However, the process of contact and drawing out of specific features shared between American evangelicals and the East Syrians, and the resultant secular nationalism, and how this nationalism has affected the Christianity itself of the Church of the East, this is something new. Nationalism, the unintended consequence of the mission encounter, emerged along with the religion-secular binary within the East Syrian community, and this was part of the modern process of religionization. That is, the emergence of religion as a discourse and then the proliferation of religion and religions all over the world through missions, colonies, and capitalism. To be sure, already in Christianity in the Roman Empire, we witness a new type of entity, one that would eventually in the modern period become religion. This entity, a portable set of creedal statements that is more easily disembedded than the ethno-religiosity of ancient religion, was further constituted in modernity when the secular became its binary other. Secularization and religionization were concomitant with one another, and then out of this comes world religion, the idea of world religions also. So I end now with the speculative suggestion that something distinctive about global Christianity is its complex imbrication within global secularism, or better to be more precise, within global secularity in its various configurations and contestations. So this is the question I'd like to end with. How is global Christianity, if it's not just a label for a discipline, related to global secularism? Or in other words, and to be more precise, would it be useful to ask how the global in global Christianity may in fact reflect something of the modern binary of religion and the secular, and the ways the conditions of belief have shifted in the modern world? Thank you.
very much, Professor Becker, for this very interesting and engaging paper. Our next speaker is Heather Sharkey. Heather Sharkey is Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of several books. One published in 2003 is entitled Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Her second book was published in 2008 by Princeton University Press and is titled American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. Professor Sharkey has also edited 2 volumes, one with the title Cultural Conversions, Unexpected Consequences of Christian Missionary Encounters in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, which was published in 2013. With Mehmet Ali Doğan, she co-edited in 2011 American Missionaries in the Modern Middle East, Foundational Encounters. She has also recently co-edited a bilingual special issue in French and English of the Canadian Journal of African Studies on the theme of Rethinking Sudan Studies. Her newest book that she authored is A History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. The title of her paper is Middle Eastern Christianity Between the Local and the Global. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sharkey.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody again, and I have to say it's a great honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been enjoying the other speeches tremendously and talking to people. But again, it really is a privilege. Oops, there you go. I want to make sure. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay. 10 years ago, I decided to write a chapter, or I agreed to write a chapter about the Middle East for a volume that a colleague, Charles Farhadian, was developing with college students in mind. The book was called Introducing World Christianity, and it aimed to provide snapshots of Christianity in different parts of the world while explaining historical developments and present trends. To get a sense of how others had approached the subject so that I could, figure out what contribution I was going to make, I decided to look at previous surveys of modern and contemporary global Christianity. And one of the surveys I examined was called The Christian World. And its author, Martin Marty, came from this institution. Professor Marty used a phrase in that book that has stuck in my mind ever since. He described the Middle East as a place where Christianity in modern times was hanging on. Many others have described the precarious footing of Middle Eastern Christianity, yet he described it with particular clarity by using just these 2 words, hanging on. The Middle East is the place where Jesus lived and died, the place where Christianity began, and yet Christianity contracted in this very region during the Islamic era. In contrast to regions like what we heard about this morning, places like sub-Saharan Africa, where Christianity was booming as the early 21st century opened, Christianity in the Middle East offered lessons about persistence in the face of difficult conditions. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 prompted large refugee movements, with Christians, as many observers observed at the time, disproportionately represented among them. We could say the same about displacements that occurred more recently in the wake of the Syrian civil war. As more Christians also emigrate voluntarily, trickling out of countries like Egypt, the description of hanging on has seemed ever more apt. In my talk today, I propose to take a long historical view of this subject before assessing where we are now. I will briefly discuss why and how Christianity went from a state of being the politically and demographically dominant religion in the Mediterranean zones of what's now the Middle East and North Africa to being what we'd call today a minority religion. I will then consider some of the changes that began to press in on the Middle East in the modern era of the 19th and 20th centuries, when foreign Christian missionaries introduced new opportunities but also new pressures, and when substantial Christian emigration from the region began. I will also briefly consider secular nationalism as a challenge that it posed to Christians. And I'm going to argue in the process two things. First is that the study of Christianity in the Middle East can illustrate how the mechanics of Muslim Christian, but also Christian or intra-Christian relations have worked and affected each other. And second, regarding the wider world, I will argue that Middle Eastern Christianity can help us to understand global Christianity singular or global or world Christianities plural in terms of long-distance linkages born from movements, ruptures, and contacts. Islam emerged in the 7th century and fostered what many Muslims came to think of as a deen wa dawla, meaning both a religion and a state. The earliest Muslims developed an army, staged conquests, and established an empire formed from lands that had belonged to the late Roman or Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian or Persian Empire. In this new territory, leaders devised policies while consulting with experts in Muslim scripture, the Quran, and bodies of emergent law, practice, and tradition. Some of these policies ended up restricting the growth of Christian communities, while either assimilating people into Muslim communities or giving others incentives to join them. And in a nutshell, early Muslim rulers recognized that Christians, like Jews, as people of the book, meaning monotheists who had scriptural traditions, could have protection if they surrendered upon conquest. Muslim rulers granted conquered peoples freedom of worship and livelihood as long as they remained loyal to the Muslim state, recognized Muslim dominance, and paid a special tax to the central treasury. This tax was called the jizya, and Christians and Jews paid it on top of anything else that they paid to support charity within their own respective communities. Muslim authorities called Christians and Jews dhimmis, meaning people who lived under the Muslim state's pact of protection. The conquest agreements of the early Islamic Empire established customs that persisted with variations for centuries. Christians could not repair or build churches without acquiring special permission from Muslim rulers. They could not disturb the soundscape by ringing church bells. Christians could not bear arms, ride horses, or serve in Islamic armies. They were supposed to wear special clothes to set themselves apart, and so on. And many of these restrictions lasted in their broad contours into the 19th century, while some, like restrictions on church building, persist in certain places even today. An Islamic system of jurisprudence took clearer shape too, and with it Islamic states recognized courts of law that asserted, for example, that non-Muslims could not inherit from Muslims. Thus, Christian wives of Muslim men or Christian relatives of recent converts to Islam lost rights of inheritance unless they also joined the Muslim community. Islamic laws and policies regarding conversion, which are still largely in place too, had a serious effect on Christians. Islamic law held that anyone could join Islam, but that no Muslim could leave it once converted or born to the faith. Leaving Islam amounted to apostasy, a crime theoretically punishable by death. So while Christians and Jews could join Islam, they could not switch to other religions. Likewise, Jews could not become Christians, just as Christians could not become Jews. Conversion could only go in one direction. Islamic law also defined the children of Muslim fathers as Muslim, regardless of their mothers' religions. And at the same time, Islamic law allowed Muslim men to marry Christian or Jewish women as fellow believers in God, even while Christian and Jewish men could not reciprocally marry Muslim females. These policies facilitated conversions to Islam, confirmed the attrition or demographic contraction of Christians, and sharply restricted Christians from evangelizing. Today, many scholars disagree over how to assess the rates of Christian attrition, but they don't disagree about Christian attrition. They concur also that by the 19th century, Christians had become a small and politically marginal segment of Middle Eastern populations in most places, or to use a term that only became common after World War I, that Christians had become definite minorities. Historically, Christian groups living under Islamic rule could only grow in two ways: through natural increase or at each other's expense, by switching churches or changing sects. Starting in the 18th century, when Catholic missionaries arrived from countries like France, and in the 19th century, when Protestant missionaries arrived from the United States, Great Britain, Sweden, and elsewhere, foreign missions did just that. They tried to grow at the expense of Eastern Christian groups by attracting members from those communities. Against the historical context of Christian attrition in Islamic domains, memories of this kind of poaching by foreign Christians, as some people perceived it at the time, led to resentments that linger among Christians even today. Christian-Muslim relations were tense in certain places and periods, but relations among different kinds of Christians were sometimes politically fraught as well, and in ways that also had consequences for Christian-Muslim relations. So to take one example, historians have long suggested that in the 7th century, the early Muslims were able to conquer Byzantine Egypt so easily because local subject Christians, the Copts on the one hand, and Byzantine Christian imperial authorities on the other, their relations were so strained, with their different opinions regarding the nature of Christ, adding a theological dimension to animosities that were already in place. Many have said that some Copts even found Muslim rule in the beginning to be more congenial than life under Byzantine authorities. In other words, that Muslim rule marked an improvement. Jack Tanous at Princeton, whose book on the making of the medieval Middle East came out last year, expressed this idea about intra-Christian dynamics very clearly. If we want to understand how Arab conquerors related to the traditions of the populations they conquered, he wrote, and more specifically, how Christians and Muslims interacted with one another, we must first understand Christian-Christian interactions in light of the irreparable fracturing of Christians into rival and competing churches. Jumping in any case to the modern era in the 19th and 20th centuries, we can see how Catholic and Protestant missionaries complicated Christian-Christian relations, even as their efforts energized and enriched Christian communities. Thanks largely to missionary schools, Christians in the Middle East became increasingly well-educated in the 19th century, increasingly well-educated relative to Muslim populations. And with education came greater prosperity, economic mobility, for example, in networks of global trade, and confidence. During the mid to late 19th century, many Middle Eastern Christian thinkers also began to embrace ideas of nationalism, and with it, hopes of achieving social and political parity relative to Muslims in the region. In ways that I discussed at length in my book that came out a couple of years ago, a variety of social pressures in the 19th century, among them this rise of Christian missionary activity, convinced Muslim leaders in the Ottoman Middle East to promote reforms that theoretically dismantled the old system of treating Christians and Jews as dhimmis, or protected subordinates, while moving towards a model of political inclusion that resembled something like citizenship. And it was this Sultan here, Abdul-Majid II, who it was during his reign that the bulk of these reforms occurred. Meanwhile, starting in the 1880s, Middle Eastern Christians began to migrate to the Americas. It helped that steamships were making, by this time, transoceanic travel fast, cheap, and convenient. Most of the migrants came from Mount Lebanon, but there were also Armenian and Coptic Egyptian Christians and others among them. And some Muslims migrated too, although the great majority of those who left the Middle East in this period were Christians, largely again because of mission school educations, which offered fluency in European languages and culture in ways that gave them confidence to venture out into the world. In the long run, most of the Christian migrants settled permanently in the Americas, not just the United States, but Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and elsewhere, where they formed diasporic communities, scattered but still connected to each other and to people in the lands from which they came. And I'm going to return to this issue about the significance of the diaspora in a few minutes. Missionary activity in the Middle East had an unintended negative consequence too, which is that it sometimes exposed Middle Eastern Christians to suspicion or hostility on the part of Muslim neighbors who feared the prospect of Christian disloyalty. In a period when Western intervention in the region was growing with heavy political, cultural, and economic consequences, some Muslims saw local Christians as potentially subversive agents as a result of their links to foreign Christians. It did not help that Britain, France, and Russia, the three great foreign powers of the 19th century Middle East, often claimed to be acting on behalf of beleaguered Middle Eastern Christians or on behalf of mission societies. And then, too, there were occasions when foreign Christians drew Muslims into their conflicts with each other. And I'm going to point here to disputes like those that broke out in the mid-19th century between French and Russian diplomats and between Catholic and Orthodox Christians over access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the church which is built on the site of Christ's crucifixion. This conflict contributed to the outbreak of the Crimean War, which sucked in the Ottoman Empire and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers. The late historian Bernard Lewis, incidentally, cited the Crimean War and the dispute among Christian powers over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and access to Jerusalem as one factor behind growing Muslim interest in the Crusades as an episode of Christian belligerence. And this interest in Crusades arguably stimulated a reciprocal modern Muslim interest in jihads and jihadism. Foreign connections gave Ottoman Muslim authorities other headaches too. So, for example, in the 1890s, some Armenian intellectuals who had emigrated to the United States used their safe distance from places like New York to lobby for international intervention on behalf of Armenian Christians who lived in the Ottoman Empire. This kind of political lobbying, coming from a historically subordinate but now increasingly outspoken Christian group, stoked tensions among Muslims in Anatolia and what is now Turkey, and these tensions simmered and erupted in the mid-1890s in a series of massacres against Armenians, which anticipated the genocides that later occurred during World War I. The 20th century brought new challenges to Middle Eastern Christians, and one was simply the challenge of being members of minorities relative to dominant majorities in the nation-state system, even or perhaps especially in places where secular nationalist government prevailed. And there are two anthropologists who've written major contributions on this subject, the late Saba Mahmood of the University of California at Berkeley and Hussein Ali Agrama from right here in Chicago. They published books considering what secular nationalism did and how it worked in late 20th and early 21st century Egypt. For me, one of the big takeaways from their books is that, and I think this takeaway goes way beyond Egypt, is that secular nationalism may have seemed to rest on principles of religious neutrality and egalitarianism, but in fact it really just made the workings of religion and power less visible as managed by regimes or dominant groups. Pointing again to Egypt, Saba Mahmood argued that the policies of secular regimes contributed to what she called the hardening of interfaith boundaries and polarizing of religious differences between Christians and Muslims in the country. Another way of saying this is that despite or precisely because of the government's secular rhetoric, religious bias became unofficial and harder to see, even as state authorities insisted that everything and that citizenship and everything and the sharing of resources was equal. regardless of how we theorize what happened, the bottom line is that many Middle Eastern Christians in the mid to late 20th century opted to emigrate if they could, leaving especially for North America and Australia. There were push factors that compelled them to leave, including political conflicts in some places and chronic low-grade or entrenched discrimination in others. There were also important pull factors that drew them abroad, including educational and professional opportunities, as well as the appeal of living in countries that had historically Christian majorities, in countries where their religion would not leave them automatically sidelined. Now, to be clear, patterns of migration were not even and smooth. In the United States, as in countries like Canada, Mexico, and Australia, immigration policies grew very restrictive during the interwar period. In the United States, the door shut with the Immigration Act of 1924, an act motivated largely by xenophobic anti-Asian and specifically anti-Chinese sentiment, and only reopened with the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which you can see President Lyndon B. Johnson signing here. Following the 40-year hiatus between 1924 and 1965, Middle Eastern Christians began to head in large numbers again for North America in the 1960s, joining other Asian and African immigrants. Many of the migrants from this late 20th century post-1965 period were highly educated people who came for advanced educations and who settled as members of the professional classes. As this generation ages, three trends are becoming apparent. First, Middle Eastern diasporic church congregations have been growing in size, number, but also internal diversity, in some cases by attracting members from non-Middle Eastern backgrounds. Second, some immigrants who prospered and succeeded are becoming philanthropists and are supporting the study of Middle Eastern Christian history, especially in U.S. colleges and universities. And third, the maturing children of these immigrants are now beginning to study Middle Eastern Christian history as well, with the result that they are injecting vitality into the academic study of the subject. And this trend is very visible, for example, if you go to the annual meetings of the Middle East Studies Association, or MESA, which is the major international conference in Middle Eastern studies. And there, panels on themes relating to Christian studies, or tagged with the label Christian studies, have become much more common in the past 10 or so years. So to conclude, let me start by saying something obvious. Regardless of the churches to which they have belonged or the cultures from which they have come, Christians have shared important things in common, and above all, devotion to Christ. That said, they have not been monolithic, and they have often disagreed and often fought with each other. In the Middle East, historic tensions among Christians, what we can think of as Christian-Christian or intra-Christian relations, have been critical to shaping Middle Eastern Christian communities. But for better or for worse, and here I think is a point that is not immediately obvious, relations among Christians have critically informed Muslim-Christian relations as well. For example, the tendency of foreign powers, nowadays more the United States than Great Britain, as well as still Russia and France, to intervene and advocate for Middle Eastern Christians, whether in the name of Christian solidarity or in terms of international religious freedom, has sometimes backfired by seeding resentments among Muslims who wonder about double standards in issues of religious human rights and about patterns of Islamophobia in Christian majoritarian countries. And to illustrate, I have a historic slide, which I think is kind of a poignant picture here that reminds us of this theme of how Christian-Christian relations involve Muslims. These are the Muslim guards at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, taken in the around the 1890s by a famous photographer named Bonfils in the Middle East. And historically, there were always Muslim guards, usually from the same families, who would stay outside the church and protect and maintain order inside to prevent the Christians from attacking one another and fighting with each other and trying to keep the peace. And this is a perfect example, I think, of Muslims having a stake in it and also being involved. And now for another set of conclusions. Since the 1960s, the movement of Christians out of the Middle East has had a striking result. It has produced diasporas that now flourish from Toronto and Los Angeles to Melbourne. These communities represent forms of Christianity that are neither Western nor Eastern, but both. They are global, not because of where they are or how many people they claim, but because of the way they cross and transcend borders. Here is where Middle Eastern Christianity can help us to think about global or world Christianities in the plural, as something that combines the universal and the specific, the local and the far-flung, and that has the capacity to be one thing and to be many. Middle Eastern global Christianity, like all global Christianities, is hybrid too, changing as it moves to new landscapes and adapts to new times. To give you a sense of what I mean with a couple of very concrete examples, I'll end with a couple of cases from the Coptic Orthodox Church. Copts began to emigrate from Egypt increasingly in the 1960s, so that today there are something like 500 congregations outside of the church's historic center in Egypt. One scholar in Toronto, for example, has established a Coptic Canadian history project, an oral and public history project to trace the community's development in Canada and to some extent next door in the United States. His project, in other words, aims to tell Canadian and more broadly North American stories of a community, many of whose members are anchored by churches. And this one up here was a digital mapping exercise to show how immigrants arrived in Toronto in one parish and how they moved over time. In Australia, meanwhile, a Coptic theological seminary, which started in the year 2000, established a new campus a couple of years ago in a purpose-built 44-story tower in downtown Melbourne. The building, the campus building and the skyscraper, not only contains worship spaces, but also community activity centers, classrooms, condos and serviced apartments, and even shops on the ground floor. And this is it. It's a Poro Tower. These are some of the apartments. I was looking at it. The next one is on booking.com. You can book a hotel room. And they built a cross into the architectural design of the skyscraper, as you can see from this image here. What is clear is that the church in Australia is feeling and acting expansive and confident, with its soaring tower acting as a metaphor for a community that is not just hanging on, but that is actively thriving. It is possible, in other words, that as Middle Eastern Christianity goes global, it may find its primary home outside the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharkey, for that wonderful paper. We got a historical perspective here also on the long-term implications of missionizing and politics. We have about 25 minutes for questions, so I'm happy to make a list. If you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, please.
Question for Professor Becker. I've seen that in the 20s, the same period of time, you're talking about some Syrians or Lebanese call themselves Phoenicians. Now, I thought that was a historical nationalist phenomenon, but fairly recently, some Syrian refugees in the Boston area have taken to calling themselves Phoenicians. and asked him about this. He says, because they don't want us where we're from. You know, in other words, it's like a new nationalism, but in another country now. Could you say something about that?
I think especially because of the way the Middle East is imagined as this place that's really old. I mean, it is a place that's really old, but the way it's imagined since the 19th century as this, the cradle of civilization, all these kinds of cliches are being old. As nationalism developed, there was, and this was an attempt to actually get beyond religious difference by going before Islam. Certain historical ethnic identities were retrieved and articulated. And you can see this in kind of Coptic nationalism, in Phoenicianism. You can see it also in Greek nationalism. You can see it in some of the strange things in the early Republican period in Turkey and Turkish nationalism. But I think part of this, it's the kind of, I think nationalism in general always likes to have that kind of long story, but it's a way of getting beyond religious difference. With regard to the recent people, it may also be something like not wanting to identify themselves as Arabs, because of Islamophobia and the kind of linkages of Arab Muslim. So I think you can see this in the early 80s with the Iranian population in the United States. Iranians often call themselves Persians as a way to avoid, like, I'm not from there because there's so much anti-Iranian sentiment. It's interesting that they're doing this now, this Phoenicianism. Is it linked to a prior one, or is it just something new?
That's why I was surprised by it, because I knew about it from the 19-teens and 20s, like between also Syrians, but now that's what surprised me.
It's still they're in Lebanon today. So there's a kind of people will talk about being Phoenician, I think, in that way. And it's a way to say, let's not talk about religion. We're all the same group of people. It ends up creating new problems because, so for example, the Assyrian identity created all these problems in the East Syrian community, and then also doesn't connect with Arab nationalism. And so it ends up creating new social differences that become contested.
Can I jump in with a couple of, to follow up actually on something that Professor Olupona said earlier. You raised the question, some people have asked you, to what do we owe Syrian refugees, or in the name of solidarity? And I think one of the things we have to be aware of is the dangers of seeming to help, in quotation marks, based on historical experiences. And the history of Christian relations, including the histories of Christian or Western imperialism, for which the memories are very strong, and therefore the possibility of endangering people that we may think we are trying to help. So that then becomes an ethical issue. And that reminds me so then I have a question, if I could, for Adam, which is thinking about the importance of the Assyrian community in Chicago. We're right in the epicenter of it, and I'm wondering if you can also say something about them and their history and how they represent the unexpected linkages and the off-site presence of Assyrians in the United States and the world.
I can't say much about it. Is there anyone actually from Chicago who knows much about the Assyrian community? Because I'm not.
Isn't this their big epicenter?
It's a big epicenter, and there's an Assyrian bookstore in the north side, which if I had scheduled things, I'd like to go visit someday.
I've just heard about it, but I don't know anything about the community there.
The Assyrian identity is really complex because, for example, to just put it very simply, if an Assyrian can convert to Islam, but it's an ethnic identity. So if I were like Italian, I could maybe I couldn't convert to Islam, but I still might be fine. This notion that like Assyrianness it's an ethnic identity, but it requires being Christian. And there are all types of contradictions in this. And how it plays out in the Assyrian community in an interesting way in Iraq is that the Assyrians tended to be more of a political problem like the Kurds in Ba'athist Iraq, because they didn't identify as Arabs. Whereas the Chaldeans, which are a different ethnic group, are just basically Catholic. It's just the Catholic Assyrians, but with a different ethnicity, identified as Arabs, and so they were Christian Arabs. So there's two different ethnic identities. One is with the dominant and fit in. And so the Christian Arab, people who identify as Christian Arab tended to be the Catholic Unionists, whereas the people who are Assyrian tend to be non-Unionists. And it's the same church historically, the same people, but because of how things unfolded, it's put them in very different political positions vis-a-vis Arab nationalism. But yeah, the Assyrian stuff, I don't know much about it. It's been here for a long time. The Assyrians, the Assyrian community were coming in by the late 19th century.
So we have three more questions. Aaron Hollander was first, I think.
Thank you. Thank you both for such rich and helpful discussions. My question for Sharkey. One element I didn't hear you speak about, but I'd be interested in knowing more how it fits into this history, is phenomena of Christian-Muslim hybridity, what we might call local religious belonging. I'm thinking in particular in the Ottoman context. My research is in Cyprus, where a community of people affiliated both with Christianity and Islam, being circumcised and baptized, speaking multiple languages, engaging in local marriage rights, etc., that thrived for hundreds of years. But thinking with you about how Christian-Muslim relations are informing one another, I think it's really striking how this community comes to be increasingly despised and marginalized by both, and both communities working together to marginalize those who are participating in these forms of hybridity. So I wonder if you speak further to that as part of the history you're bringing out.
So, fascinating topic, extremely important. Many, as you say, many hybrid groups, sometimes you'll see them called crypto-Christians, crypto-Jews. You don't hear the term crypto-Muslims, but I think it should, you can throw that out there too. Interestingly, in the late 19th century, the Muslim authorities, influenced by Christian missionaries, began to decide that groups that tended to be, that were ambiguous, should be Muslim. And so they initiated a Muslim missionary movement, which attempted to bring groups like the Alawites and the Yazidis and the Druze into mainstream Islam, and that then ended up stimulating uprisings and resistance movements and so on. And we can see the legacies of that today. So and then of course then you get into the 20th century, and governments gain control over textbooks, and governments take control over religious instruction in schools. And it's at that moment when people have to really definitively say what they are, if they're Christian or Muslim, and then of course the Jews end up leaving from the area as well. So that tolerance for religious hybridity on the official level becomes, it starts to disappear in the 20th century and create more polarization.
Also, related to these hybrid groups, there's also just even non-hybrid shared spaces, which disappear. That is, there's all these shrines where Jews, Christians, Muslims, various types of Jews, Christians, and Muslims all over are gone.
So it's usually replaced with minarets, shrines that people there's oral history about, but then you go to the place and there's a physical structure that spiritual influence.
But then, of course, this is all different from the much later emergence of groups like Muslim Believers in Christ. Some of whom in the late 20th century start to call themselves that because they need to emphasize their Muslim identification in order to avoid, or to try unsuccessfully to avoid a degree of state persecution. And then anthropologists, especially in the early 21st century, have studied the Muslim practice. It's not a reciprocal Christian practice of going to Muslim spaces as much, but becoming Muslim practice of going to Christian sites in places like Istanbul and Muslims visiting Christian shrines. But actually, there are others. Angie can also speak to that in Egypt.
There was one question.
Question for Professor Sharkey. How do you see the situation and future for Palestinian Christians?
I didn't raise that example in the case study, but in the discussion, but it follows this general pattern: steep decline in the numbers of Christians, whether they were living as religious minorities, whether in Muslim states or in a Jewish state like Israel. It's just not as congenial to be living as a religious minority in a different religious majoritarian state. So the numbers are set to continue to decline not through conflict or forced expulsion, but just through steady low-grade emigration where opportunities present themselves.
Thank you for this presentation. I'm kind of thinking about that lecture. It's possible for me to take exactly everything you have said and compose it on the Nigerian situation, northern Nigeria, and it will fit to that. So for me, I begin to raise issues related to constitutionality. And I'm trying to see why, as a Nigerian, as an African, I'm beginning to take certain positions on the state of Christianity in the world that is related to my scholarship, but at the same time it is not. So the question for me is that what is the responsibility of a scholar? Particularly a scholar who defines himself as a Christian in the context of the crisis that we are going through. Fast forward to America, and let's go to Harvard. It was not difficult for Harvard to raise a lot of money from the Middle East to establish what they call our linked chair. There are about 6 of them. I succeeded in getting one from them for the School of Divinity for Christianity, for Islam in Africa. If a Christian philanthropist comes with that same body of money, then you know what? I want us to create here Christianity in a non-European context at Harvard will say, hey, what are you talking about? So what does that mean to us? So as a result of these kinds of things we're talking about, the activities relating to the study of Islam, it's virtually so much on that campus. So it is hard for me as a Nigerian, as an African who is in this country, who is going through this type of issue, to be very quiet. So the question intellectually and academically is that, what is our responsibility as scholars to the community we belong to? And I'm not an evangelical Christian, I'm pretty liberal. My brother as well. I'm very, very liberal. So how do I, I'm going to argue. So to make sure I'm doing the right thing.
So really difficult question. I have a couple of thoughts. So first, part of the money a large part of the money that has gone into the expansion of the study of Islam in American universities has connections to histories of Orientalism and American defense interests. So there's a sort of a sinister Islamophobic impulse in some ways behind the support for Islamic studies, some of it. And Dana Robert has discussed the decline and discrediting of mission studies and the historical reasons for why Christianity became less acceptable. We were talking about that last night before dinner. When I worked on my second book, my former PhD advisor told me that writing about evangelicals might destroy my career, might ruin my credibility as a scholar by writing about Christians. So there's that impulse behind it. But then in terms of your question about what is the responsibility of the scholar, I don't have any answers about the responsibility of scholars towards the Middle East. But I have thoughts about the responsibility of scholars towards the United States, because this is my home. And my responsibility as I try to live it is to teach in a way that respects the diversity of my students and that considers them like members of one family, one community, and therefore to respect the plurality and diversity of backgrounds and cultures and traditions that they come from, and to reach a point when we can study a history like the history of the Middle East, which can be so fraught, and to try to do it in a mutually respectful, caring, and productive way that enables us at the same time not to avoid difficult questions, but to confront and try to talk through them. So this issue of responsibility, I don't know for the Middle East, but for here, I think we can try to model the kind of society that we want to have in our own midst through the university.
Something in response to what you just said would be this. First of all, I'd say peace be upon you. To promote the diversity of everyone in whatever people believe. The problem is if someone believes wrongly, there's a real hell, there's a real judgment day coming. Okay? And we know that by the fact that we see injustices in this world. People are vandalized, they're killed, right? And so by the fact that we see injustices, that of itself, if we hold to God being a just God, is evidence that there's a judgment day coming. So to promote that, well, you could just continue on in what you're doing, and you do what you're doing, and you do what you're doing. While I agree we shouldn't force people into what is truth, we should not, if we know something is wrong, encourage them into what's wrong.
I'm not from a theological seminary, I'm from a history department, and so my role is to teach history. And my role is not to correct people or to lead them to religious truth.
Question for Dr. Becker. You left a question hanging out at the very end that was really intriguing to me. And so I didn't know if you had any speculations on it, given that you raised it. And the question of the connection between this kind of growth of secularity and growth of this some sort of understanding of global Christianity. I don't know if you have any initial thoughts on that. I found that intriguing.
I have too many thoughts, but I'm probably just repeating it in a way what I was saying, but I think if we could, and this relates to the question I think I asked Professor Kwok this morning, that is there something in the term global that we can kind of identify as that this is distinct about when we talk about Christianity today, as opposed to just saying, okay, global Christianity is all over the place. It's always been all over the place. So what? Then Christianity's always been global. Why call it global? Just call it Christianity. That there is something distinctive in the modern period in the way religion unfolds and the way that it exists within vis-a-vis various what we call secularities. That is the decline of religion or the cementing of religion, politics, economics. That's at least imagined by some people, and that people can actually talk about, and put it most simply, people can talk about religion as religion. And as Christianity is labeled a religion, and then there's world religions, and then people identify as a religious person or a not religious person, all those issues, which then are personal issues about ourselves, but also political issues and institutional issues because of governments and everything else, and the international legal order. So all these things are different about, and it has an effect on Christianity and its limits. And then also there's contestations around that, right? Because some people would say that, okay, Christianity is more than just some private thing, and then there's a fight around that. So that whole fight around the binary of the religious and the secular may say something about this modern phenomenon of global Christianity. And then you can see the boundaries shifting. So, for example, the Pentecostalization of the church, at least the little I've read about it is there's also political effects. There's like questions about political theology and its relationship to the state. So all that, you don't have any of that complexity, I think, in the pre-modern period. I mean, there's different complexities, but it's just not that complex. Once religion is named religion and spoken about as this thing, it changes religion. And that is what I was suggesting with regard to global.
Yes, Professor Hall.
I want to engage with Dr. Becker because the topic is of interest to all of us. The pre-global, because you mentioned that Christianity has always had this global imagination. Matthew 25, okay, make disciples in all nations. And then, so many of us grew up thinking that Jews is an ethnic religion. Christianity global, because then it broke through these confines of the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And our colleague, Denise Bill, wrote this book, Why This New Race? Contesting. No, you look at the Greek fathers. In fact, they had to construct a new race, Christians, vis-a-vis the Jews, the Romans, and the Greeks, to define who they are. So it is not that they are disembedded, which you mentioned towards the end. So I was wondering whether in Syrian Christianity or in Syriac Christianity, there was other imagination about the group. The Syrian missionaries were the first who went to China, for example. So did they envisage a group that's quite different from the Greeks or the Romans?
With regard to the Denise Buell's book, I mean, what she's doing there is basically saying Christians are looking for a way to talk about social groupings and kind of metaphorized the social genera to talk like, so that what was she, that Christians are like a third race, I think is what she's taking this from, I forget, second century apologist. So what, I think I'm going to answer this circuitously, that is that something I thought about from Professor Roberts' talk in the beginning, the issue of the imagination of the global, and how with the development of academic missiology, there were maps and certain statistics. And I was thinking about, when you spoke about this, that at the mission that I worked on, in the mid-19th century, they had a globe. They brought this globe to Iran, and they were showing the locals, and the globes, and they had maps, and color-coded maps, which reminded me of, like, you know, my childhood of, like, you know, Cold War maps with, like, you know, there was red and there was green or whatever the distinctions were. But I was thinking about, on the one hand, because Christianity is always global because it says go to the ends of the earth and go forth, convert people. But on the other hand, like, there may be different notions of the global, different imaginings of the global in different mission settings. So I was thinking about how this being there with a globe and maps and getting together the whole community as they do it in the mission I work on, and having everyone once a month engage in a concert of prayer where you're praying for the conversion of all the nations. And they thought, at least, that everyone else around the world on that same day, I think the first of the month or something like that, everyone around the world is praying at the same time. And they're praying at the same time for the various nations. So the people all at the mission in Iran are all there as Assyrians, thinking of themselves as, we're a nation, we're praying for these other nations. And they have a globe there, and they're looking at the globe. That's a really different object of mission than what we have in, say, the Nestorian mission of the Middle Ages. They're thinking the four corners of the earth. They're thinking the earth's flat, actually. And it's a very different globe. So it's an issue of continuity and discontinuity. The Christians are obviously fulfilling a certain mission, but if we look at it really closely, like, what is it that they see themselves doing? And there's something very secular, modern, materialistic about this 19th century onward mission where they're objectifying the world and imagining it from above in ways that it was rather, let's go over there, when the Assyrians are traveling across Asia converting people. Sorry for the long answer.
So we have arrived at the end of this session. I would like to thank both speakers again for the thought-provoking papers.